Good morning, everybody, and welcome to DataZoom's Data Leadership, Wisdom and Insight series. And today my special guest is Nicola Askham. And Nicola is the data governance coach. Nicola, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
And hopefully you're sitting comfortably and ready to wax lyrically about data governance.
Yes, of course.
My name's Samir Sharma, and I'll be your host this morning. Nicola, I probably wouldn't do justice to your profile enough, but if you could give me a 30,000 helicopter view of you and your profile, that would be great.
Yes, of course. So, as you correctly said, I'm known as the data governance coach. I've been doing data governance for, it'll actually be 16 years next month.
Wow.
I helped got into the role at the beginning of January, so it makes it very easy for me to remember when the next year. I got into it totally by mistake. I was a project manager for a data warehouse project, and we did lots of things wrong, but along the way I suddenly realized that nobody was worried about the quality of the data.
Right.
And it kind of stuck with me, and a little while later I got the opportunity to make up my own job, and I started to think about roles and responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's fair to say that, in the early days I wasn't very good at it, and I made every mistake in the book. But I think the nice thing is, and the nice thing for my clients these days is, because I had that experience, I've tried lots of different ways of doing data governance. I did it at the bank for a few years, and thanks to restructures, I had several attempts at it before I joined. I worked for 2 small consultancies before I went independent, and so over the years, I've kind of worked out what works, what doesn't, and then there's a small bucket of things that sometimes work depending on the culture of the organisation, and I've used them to base my methodology. So I do still do some data governance, but I actually spend most of my time training and coaching people to do it themselves.
Yes.
I truly believe that's the best thing for an organisation. And I love it because I get to inspire more people to be enthusiastic about data governance.
No, and I think that's one of the tricky things these days is for people to get excited by it. And I think we've got a range of people on the call who have signed up and are listening in. One of the quick things I'm going to remind everybody on the call is there's a little button here. There's a little chat option. So in about 30 minutes, I'm going to turn the tables over to the audience, and you can provide me with some live questions so that I can ask your questions to Nicola. So just bear that in mind. I still have plenty of things in my mind that I'm sure will crop up if questions don't come. But Nicola, I'm often asked when working with organizations, and like you, I've been working in the data field for about 20 years now. Why should organizations implement data governance?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think there's lots of reasons, but it's very easy to look at the generic ones, and I think that's kind of one of my caveats that I said to people. I'm quite happy to share with you the generic ones, but you need to find out why your particular company wants it, because spouting the generic ones that Nicola told you doesn't normally sell it to people. But there's going to, depending on the industry, there's bound to be some regulatory requirements for it. That's particularly true in the financial services industry. And even the blessed GDPR, although that's data protection, some of the requirements of that actually are met by having a good data governance framework in place. So that then applies to anybody who has personal data. But apart from that, it can lead to efficiency, reducing costs, better customer service, all sorts of things, just compliance with other regulations, because anything where you have to provide data to prove compliance, you need your data to be good enough. And data government helps you doing that. So, yeah, there's all sorts of reasons, but I think it's sort of finding which ones are the actual driver for your organisation is actually key, because if you just spout the generic ones, people go, oh, that's fine, we're doing fine without it, we've survived however many years, why do we need it now? Sure.
And I think you've touched on it. It's often the why that companies need to do it. And I think there's 2 elements. There's probably in data strategy terms, we often talk about offensive and defensive. And I think what you've just talked about is that whole world in the regulatory aspect, which is very defensive. when you're attempting to do things with customers and trying to generate revenue, etc. That's more offensive. So you need to get a balance between the two.
Yeah, very much so. And I think doing it from an offensive point of view, a defensive point of view, is if you focus only on that, I think you're limiting the value and the benefits you can receive. Mm-hmm. And that's when you get the approach that I've I've heard, and I'm sure you have the same, where people say, "What's the minimum I can do to keep the regulator happy?" And I think that's really bad way to go about data governance. You probably won't keep the regulator happy, and you won't deliver anything that will add any wider business benefits and value.
Absolutely. So listen, people are just joining, and they probably didn't hear the first question, some of those people. But I want to strip it back to basics. How would you, as the data governance coach, define data governance for those on the call?
Oh, good question. So I actually, if you Google data governance now, there are thousands probably of different definitions. I wish there had been when I started, but I was making it up as I went along. And there's some very, detailed ones. A lot of the official ones that I think are better than most still upset me because they include words like security and protection, and data governance doesn't cover those. Mm-hmm. Data governance underpins and supports all data management disciplines. But I think the best way of thinking about it, and the way I like to talk, particularly when I'm talking to business users, because they don't really care about the what. They care about the outcome, what's in it for them. Mm-hmm. So I like to talk about data governance being all about proactively managing your data to help your organization achieve its strategy and vision. Mm-hmm. So, because that's firmly putting it in the place of what your individual senior stakeholders are tasked with. They'll be tasked with delivering some part of the strategy. It's never a good idea to manage all data perfectly. So by being proactive and focusing on those things, you'll be focusing on the right thing. And you can put controls in where it's necessary and not where it's not, and and manage it appropriately. So, and I think it's made up of, I say that you have a data governance framework is made up of three things. Mm-hmm. A policy, which says what you will do, and that actually kind of makes it official. Your company has said you are going to manage data. You have some processes, because otherwise people won't consistently do the same thing and approach it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I'm sure, Samir, you've been to the same kind of meetings I have where we can discuss something, all be in violent agreement that we're all going to do something. But when we come back to the next meeting, you look at me and say, well, I thought you were going to do it. And I go, oh, no, I thought you were going to do it. We absolutely need clear roles and responsibilities so that we don't all agree that data governance is a good thing and somebody else will do it for us. It's, we have some defined roles and responsibilities so everybody's clear on what their role is under the data governance framework.
Absolutely. It's a good point. I think you've been to the same meetings that I've been, or you've been a fly on the wall. I think those are three key points, actually: policy, process, roles and responsibilities. But recently, I've been hearing two terms banded around, which often get slightly confusing for people. And I'll walk into, certainly in meetings, the two concepts keep coming up. And I will continue to have to correct. Or when I go to conferences and somebody's talking about data governance, they often interchangeably use information governance as well. How do you define and separate the two so that data governance is clear and information governance is clear? Because those two things are often, used in the same sentence and to reference the same thing.
It is. It's frustrating, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's a good question. I come across that a lot. And even, I think the trouble is that for me, personally, I believe that data is the building blocks. This is the individual data fields or attributes, if we're being correct. Yeah. They're data, and you can manage them at that level. So it could be a date field, and we don't know what it is, and then we suddenly realize it's a date of birth field. But while it's at that level, it's just a date, and all we can is it a valid format or something? And it's only when we put it in context, so it becomes a record that we actually know that it's my date of birth or your date of birth or something, and it's part of our customer record. So that's where you switch from, the individual bits of data you can govern at an individual level. It's a lot easier. Yeah. And then information governance is when you're governing it over records. Now, that's harder because those can be changing all the time. And sometimes I've worked with some organizations who realize that information governance is more when you're talking about records management, when you're creating documents or reports using that data. So my personal preference is that you get the data governance in place.
Yes. That
is in place at the granular level. You can combine the data. I was going to say any way you like, but within reason. That's where the information governance comes in place. Yeah. So you can combine that data with the confidence that the underlying data is correct. And the information governance then looks at, is it right to combine these things together to get the right picture or analysis or answer that we're looking for?
So great answer. I really love that. So effectively, one lays the foundations, the other one provides the context.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. No, I like that. So just, data governance is a, I often say that there's a renaissance in data at the moment. And I use that term quite a lot these days because I see that with the people that we work with. But there's an interesting thing that recently I've seen. A lot of companies are still not taking data governance as seriously, even though we've had things like GDPR and so on. And I think there's a statistic out there which still says about 15% or maybe now it's up to 20% of companies that do perform data governance are the ones that are successful. So why do you think companies are failing at data governance right now?
Well, I think there's a few reasons.
Yeah.
The biggest one that I think I've come across is that a lot of people think it's a project. Particularly perhaps companies that are doing it to meet a regulatory requirement. So they think that you have a project, you tick the boxes, and then you can stop. And I actually met somebody last week who, an organisation, I won't even tell you the industry in case you can work out, made its whole data governance team redundant because they decided it was a project being done. I was absolutely
goodness me.
So I think there is that kind of image side, and I always go out of my way to say data governance isn't a project. But I think the other part of it is that it's the cultural change side of it, and people don't address that enough. And I actually think it's the key thing that you have to address, because you've got to get people thinking about data instead of thinking it's just an annoying, byproduct of their work or something that just makes it harder. And until you address that side of it, it's almost like you're fighting this losing battle, or you're just treading water at best. You continue to throw resources at it, and the data governance team shouldn't be doing much. They should be supporting the business doing it themselves.
Yes.
And if you get that culture change, that doesn't happen, and it doesn't get embedded, and then I think that's what causes. I usually hear it calls them having to restart the data governance initiative or whatever. It's the first time I've heard of them actually making the whole data governance team redundant.
That's bizarre.
Scary.
I mean, no one, in my mind, data governance never ends. So. Exactly. And quite rightly, you said it's not a project. It's a long-running program of things that needs to be measured and continuously reviewed to make sure that you're hitting your goals. But on that note, actually, what you've talked about cultural change and teams specifically. Now, when I raise the term data governance, everybody rolls their eyes. How do you take a term like that? How do you organise a business and teams around data governance?
So you're talking about the structure. You're right. It's a boring term. When I met my husband, and we were kind of going to parties to meet each other's friends, and we'd go to parties, and we'd meet somebody neither of us knew, and they would kind of say, "What do you do?" And I do data governance, and they would glaze over, and they would look up at my husband beseechingly, going, "What do you do? And please say it's not the same stuff."
A conversation killer. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the trouble with we're not ever going to win the battle in trying to change it. It's a misused term, but I think we're better off using our efforts to educate people in what it really is, rather than trying to change the job title at this stage. But how I'd organise it is I quite often talk about the 3 lines of defence, which I'm sure you've come across if you've worked in financial services. And whenever I'm in financial services helping them do data governance, I find that they like to put data governance in the second line. So if any of the people listening haven't heard of it, the first line is the business, the people who are actually doing the work of whatever the organisation does. The second line are the teams like risk and compliance, so the people who set the rules and tell the first line what rules they have to comply with or interpret regulation. And the third line is internal audit or external audit, who come and check that the first line are meeting the rules set by the second line.
Yeah.
So quite often I find that data governance is put in the second line. Now, I find that works really well. You get to work really closely with the op risk team, and if you think about it, risks to data are only really a specific type of operational risk or issue. So they're a good team to work with, to get the message out, to do some of this cultural change. But there is sometimes this image, therefore, that the data governance team will do everything and just set the rules and throw them at the business. But it doesn't work like that. I actually think that data governance is somewhere like 1.5, which never actually...
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah.
So I think you need a central data governance team to support the whole framework. But actually, it's the first line themselves. You get them to agree to be data owners, get them engaged, so they then set the rules themselves. And your job as the data governance team is to support them, because if you think about how you felt the first time you heard about data governance, all the business are like this. They have no idea what this thing is. So they need a lot of support and hand-holding in the early days of helping them understand what it is, to help them set their own rules, and then help them monitor against those rules. So it might be that the data team runs the data quality reports and things like that, but against the rules that the data owners themselves have set. So I believe that most of the work should be done in the business.
Yes.
But I've never seen it done successfully without some central support. And obviously it's more support in the early days, but you always need some. And as you said, it's a long-term thing. This doesn't go away. So the data governance framework has to evolve and change as your business changes.
Absolutely.
So that central team can make sure that it's constantly evolving and meeting the business needs as the business evolves and the strategy changes.
So in previous questions you've used the word framework, and when people talk about frameworks, it makes me shudder a little bit, because I feel that frameworks are thrust upon people. Do you think that there is a one definite framework for data governance that you would advocate, or I'll leave the question like that, actually.
No, I don't think there is. So I think you need a framework, and it will consist of those three things: the policy, the processes, the responsibilities. But I don't believe there's such a thing as a standard framework that works for everybody. And I think that is where a lot of people go wrong. And I can't tell you how many LinkedIn requests or emails I get that say, please can you send me the standard data governance? And I go,
these standards, yes.
There isn't one. And I think that if you trust to, if you took one that I designed for one client and tried to implement it in another organisation, even if they were in the same industry, it's unlikely to work, because they won't have exactly the same structure and they won't have the same culture.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right.
I think there are some bits that are often the same, and I think if you look at all of the frameworks that I've ever designed, they've probably got a lot of things in common, but there are subtle differences, and that takes into account the organisation and sometimes just the size of it. I did some work for a small charity a couple of years ago, and they only had 80 staff. And we decided that if we had data owners and data stewards, about half the company would be a data owner or a data steward, or half the charity. And we thought that was ridiculous. You couldn't have that. So we actually didn't have data stewards. We only had data owners.
Right.
So it's certain things like that, and you work out how many you have, how you distribute them, at what level of seniority will depend on the company.
And you bring up the point about how the teams and how the business and the organisation would be structured, and you've used the word data steward and data owner. These are terms that I often hear, and I, as you say, it's not one size fits all for organisations. Are you wedded to specific terms when you're coaching and advising people on what types of individuals they need? Because we often are stuck and strapped to these naming conventions, what would you advocate for an organisation who, doesn't necessarily have hundreds of people to chuck at this initiative? What would you say are the key roles, the key things that they need to bear in mind?
So, yeah, I think you're right. I actually wrote a blog that I shared on LinkedIn just a few weeks ago called "Do We Have to Call Them Data Owners?"
Oh, okay.
Because that is a
shame on me. I didn't read it.
Oh no, that's fine. But it's a topical thing, and it comes up time and time again. Now I start with kind of my standards, what I call my best practice ones.
Sure.
But I don't mind whether I combine things if that's the right thing to do, and I don't really get het up on the names now, because in the early days I would have met you and I would have thought, oh no, I think Samir owns some data here and I must get him to agree he's a data owner, and we'd be having a heated discussion and I'd be thinking, oh, this is really frustrating, and then I suddenly think, hang on a minute, if I actually stopped a second and listened to what Samir is saying, he's quite happy to do what I'm asking him to do. He doesn't want to be called a data owner.
Yes.
So I realised that the best thing to do is to focus on the responsibilities and not worry so much about the names. Now, I will always start with a data owner and a data steward because they make sense. They're more commonly used than anything else. But I've done quite a lot of work in the higher education sector this year as well. And one thing I found, one of the universities I was doing some training for, we started the phone call to prepare for their training. I was doing some data owner and data steward training for them. And she rang me up and she was in a right state. And she went, oh, my God, I've just found some stuff on your website and I've done it all wrong. Oh. And I went, what do you mean you've done it all wrong? And she went, well, there's this, I've been arguing the case, but I keep getting told the university owns the data. Can't have data owners. And she said, but I needed people who were senior who would be accountable for individual data sets. And I said, yeah, that's right. And she said, so I've called them data stewards, and now I've realised that I should have called the next level down data stewards. And I basically said to her, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't, yeah.
What you need to do is tell me what you've called them and who's what, so I can translate and make sure I train the right people. The right. I said, but what's more important, you choose job titles that work in your organisation. So one company, I was an insurer a few years back, they really didn't like the term data owners. So they had executive business stewards.
Okay, that's a new one.
Yeah, it's the only place I've seen that work, but it worked. Yeah. You know, my RSI, lots of typing, but it was kind of, apart from that, it worked for them, and that they could get their head round. So I kind of say, I like having some senior people accountable for sets of data. So I would call them a data owner to begin with. And I get that if they're senior enough to be effective as a data owner, they actually probably don't have the time, the knowledge, or the inclination to get their hands dirty with the detail. So they're going to need some support. So they're going to have one or more data stewards to help them do that. But again, call them what you like. So, you know, well, within reason. I think
within reason, absolutely.
I actually say to a client, no, that's stupid. Nobody will take it seriously. Apart from that, normally people come up with sensible names. Okay,
well that's good. I'm going to ask you one other question, which we've talked about team. Who runs the data governance initiative? Who's the person who sits above it to make sure that culture is blended into it and that change management is working within the business? Who do you see as that person?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's not an easy answer. So I would say the easy part of the answer is you need a senior executive sponsoring data governance, because without it, you really won't be successful. You might have some short-term success, but you're not ever going to be able to get this really embedded and sustainable. If you have a chief data officer, then in my mind there's absolutely no debate for it. The data governance team should be reporting to the CDO. Sure. And they should be responsible for it. Now, most people will never believe me when I say this, but I still haven't worked for an organisation that has a CDO.
Oh, so, really? That is amazing.
I know, which is it's quite funny. I was presenting at an event earlier this year, and somebody said to me, where should the data governance team report? And I was going through various options that I'd seen work ones to definitely avoid. And somebody from the back of the room shouted, "You're wrong. You haven't said CDO." And,
Oh,
okay, and I said, no, I totally get what you're saying, and I think that the role is definitely maturing and becoming a valuable and considered a valuable role now. And if you have one, absolutely, the data governance team should report to them. But I just haven't worked for a client that has a CDO, which is quite amazing, but hasn't stopped us doing data governance effectively. But you do need senior. So I found a chief risk officer is usually quite effective.
I mean, and in banking, that's where I would see that sitting, because risk and compliance are always those types of areas.
Yeah, so that's what. Well, though I'm doing some work for a bank at the moment, and their CRO is not interested.
Okay.
So we actually got the COO.
Yes,
doing
that's
it
another area.
on the basis that all the people who will be data owners will report to him or do report to him. So up for it. So I'm always open-minded as long as I've got somebody senior who's supporting it and publicly supporting it, not just saying, yes, I can be a name on a piece of paper that says I'm the sponsor for it. Then I think make it work. Yeah, I don't like doing it from IT.
Yes.
That doesn't work very well. Although I have made it work from IT, if that's been absolutely, but that's only been in a company that's relatively small in terms of number of employees.
Right, so you can be a little bit more agile in that respect and flatter.
And I would have said that, yes, technically I sat within IT and they paid my bill, but I spent my time talking to business people, so it's very hard to do it within IT, and I recommend that as a way forward.
Agreed. And funny enough, we worked with a company that did have a CDO that didn't want to have anything to do with data governance. So that's another interesting fact from me, which I was absolutely stunned about. And actually, we worked with the CFO for that, which was bizarre. I think the reasons were legacy and historical, to be frank. The CDO came in much later, so the work, the CFO had already got the mandate to do that and was starting to kick that off. And we came in and suddenly a CDO was brought in. So they were more. They started working more with architecture and getting a sense of what was required in terms of a data strategy. So we helped them with that, but equally we gelled the two together. So it worked. One had the money pool, so the CFO was, the person who had the money, and the CDO had it. It took time for them to get the gravitas to then lead it much later on. But that's my experience. One thing I'd like to specifically ask is, and I get asked this all the time, when companies are putting a business case together for a data strategy, and when I say data strategy, I mean things around data governance and data architecture and what the business wants to do in their vision and where they want to go. But I'm often asked to put a business case that delivers ROI for data governance. How do you respond to that when people ask you? How do I justify it?
Oh, it's really, really hard. And every time I go to conferences, if I see anybody that any presentation that says it's about the delivering the metrics to measure business value, I go, let's see if somebody's cracked it and found the magic answer. It's really, really hard, as you know, Samir, and
it is.
because there are, nobody can dispute that there are benefits to be had from data governance, but they tend to take a long time to come, and a lot of them, at the start of your data governance initiative, you don't even know what problems you're going to solve, so you can't categorize them and say, oh, I'm going to save you X. So it's a chicken and egg situation.
Sure.
So I find doing a formal business case is really, really hard. It's been on my list of content to create for ages, is to create a guide for a business case. And I always get stuck with it because I always go, but I really struggle with it. And if I struggle, anybody that's never done one before will really struggle.
Yeah.
Because I think you have to do, my favourite thing I always tell my clients to do is look for your data quality horror stories.
Oh.
So try and find out what has gone wrong. Because if you just go and say, this is why I said earlier about the don't like generic benefits. If you just go and say, oh, well, we'll become efficient and we'll improve customer relations and we'll improve relations with our suppliers and things, and you go, yeah, that's all very well, but you'll have people saying, yes, but we're a successful company with how we currently manage our data. So what's in it? Why should we do it? Kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But if you absolutely prove that there's been losses or reputational damage, something that's arisen from some poor data quality, and you can say, if we'd had data governance, this wouldn't have happened. And you can, it helps make your case greatly. So, but if you talk too generically about things, it kind of, people can't get their head around it. But you kind of need to find things. So thinking one client where we introduced the data issue resolution process was an insurer, and I went round all the teams presenting, this is what you do if you think you've got a problem with data, and this is the process, and we'll help you sort them out. Nobody said anything when I met the reserving team, and they all just sat there really quietly, and they all went, okay, that's fine. And I'm thinking, these are huge consumers of data in insurance companies, or the actuaries that sit on the reserve.
Yeah, of course they are.
No issue. In my experience, they must have data issues. Nobody said anything. And then about half an hour later, I was sitting at my desk, and one of them came up to my desk, and he said, I was at your presentation earlier. I'm one of the student actuaries on the team. And he said, and I've never really thought about it because I was trained that this is what I do, but at the first of, beginning of every quarterly cycle when we're doing our reserving, I get a spreadsheet from finance, and it's rubbish. So I spend 2 weeks every quarter formatting it, removing the duplicates, and generally just fixing it all before we even load it into our model. Yeah. And I said, okay. And he said, is that a data quality issue? And I went, yeah. Certainly. And he said, and I said, look, I know you're a student actuary, but we pay you a lot of money, don't we? And he said, so you're now telling me 2 weeks every quarter, you're just...
of your time.
And I said, how long have you been doing this? And he said, well, I've been doing the role 18 months, and I was trained by the previous person that is what you do. And at no point had they ever gone back and talked to finance about, this is what I want and why we need it this way.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, actually, because one of the things that often comes up is that companies think that data governance is going to be this big bang. We're just going to come in and suddenly data governance is going to be all over the business, and we're going to have data owners and this and that, and we're going to clean up the data and quality. It doesn't happen like that. It's simply about finding those areas that you've just talked about. Where are the areas that actually you have loss in terms of time, you have expense, that's generated through bad processes, and that's often where you can start first, and just showing the value very quickly like that, because no doubt, I'm sure, taking that 2-week process and bringing it down into an automated view won't take that long, to be honest, and that the value would be so quick that companies will realize that from a business perspective, that, I get what you're doing now. And it actually, data governance means something different. It means quality. It means my business impact. And you hit the nail right on the head there. That is basically what it boils down to at the end of the day.
And I think everybody, and I'm sure you've the same, when you start, digging around, asking questions, there are data stories. Some are bigger than others, and the bigger the better when you're trying to make the...
Oh, of course. Yeah.
But try and find these ones and say, if this is the one that I found in just a little bit of asking around, how many do you think we really have that I can solve if you let me do data governance?
Yes. Yeah. We've just gone past 11:30. I haven't seen anybody who's sent in any questions, so I'm happy to continue asking away my questions. But I will still put it out there to the audience. If you do want to ask Nicola a question, there is a chat box which you can put your question into, and I will ask away. I have one other question which it always sits at the back of my mind. And, I've been running data projects for, probably the same as long as you, took 20-odd years. At the beginning, there was no real tooling for data governance. Nobody talked about, there's this technology that we can use. But there probably were very limited ones, and they were very expensive. But nowadays, there are a number of vendors that are coming out and saying, we can do data governance. You don't need to do anything now. Just use our tool. I'm not too sure about that because I still think you need the areas that you talked about, policy, process, roles and responsibilities and the standards around that. Are we in danger of putting too much trust in tech in this area?
I think that is a very good question. And I think in the early days, I think you could probably trawl LinkedIn or Twitter or something and find some comments from me from back 6, 7 years ago where I was going, data governance tools, you shouldn't have them, kind of blah, blah. But I've only used one, to be fair. I've used Calibra.
Right.
But I've got a good relationship with one of the others, and obviously when I'm at conferences, I always go and have a look because I'm always interested to see what's out there.
Of course.
So I have revised my opinion. I think they can be great enablers.
Yes.
But I think your point is spot on, and definitely agrees with my way of thinking. But I think, strangely, data governance is more about the people and the processes than the actual data itself, strangely.
Yeah.
And the tools can facilitate, and they can be really great at that. And if you've got a complicated setup with data or a large organisation split over many locations, I think that the tools can be invaluable. You know, so, but what I do think is that even in the circumstances where they would be really good, some people still try and dive in too quickly, and they don't really know what they want to do. And also I've seen I've spoken to a couple of places where IT have bought the tool to do data governance for them. And I even know from talking to the software vendors that, you know, they've had people say to them, you know, actually your software is rubbish. And they go rushing in to say, well, what's wrong with it? And they go, well, it's not doing data governance. And they go, no, people do data governance.
Yes.
The tool helps them.
Yeah, this supports the process in the end once it's...
very much so. So it can't help you fast track the cultural change and the people side of it. That needs to happen. And then the tool will then support those people who are now thinking and worrying about their data in doing data governance.
No, it's a very good point, because I find that often with the converse, when we're looking at putting in other types of data and management activities around maybe dashboards and so on, people have done the same thing, you know, chuck their confidence in a piece of tech but actually doesn't deliver it until they've got the basics right. But you know what, you brought up a really good point about the change management piece, and I wanted to ask, how do you couple data governance and change management to ensure that the culture of the organization becomes more data informed?
That's a good question. Once or twice I've worked at large organizations that have like specialist change management teams, because a lot of organizations say that it's change management and they really just mean it's their project managers, don't they? Kind of, but I have worked, you know, over the years once or twice with places where they've had that special function. That has been brilliant, because what they've done is appointed their own communications managers or change managers to be part of the project.
Sure. And
they have really helped with getting that message out. That's a kind of a luxury you don't often come across.
No.
But you know, one time in particular when the biggest kind of project that I was involved on where we did that, I learned so much from the comms manager in particular that these days I try to I feel that whoever is running the data governance initiative, so we were talking earlier about it not being a project. But you have a project-like thing to get it implemented, or, you know, get the initiative going. So I always try not to call it a project, but you do have to have a kind of focused activity to get data governance framework designed, and the cultural change. And it's at that point, in that stage there, you need somebody who's worrying about doing the communications and the cultural change side of things. Most of the time, it's whoever's acting as the data governance manager, whether they're an interim or the final person. And I think that adds its challenges, because you're asking somebody to be worrying about data governance, but also being an expert communicator and getting that message out across the whole organisation in as many different ways as possible.
Yeah, and you know what? The reason I asked that question is because when I first started doing data projects and so on, I remember my first, I would say, mentor in the data area. It's a long time ago. And I remember him saying to me, Samir, it's not about anything else other than communication. And if you can communicate the objectives and the vision to the right people in their language, then they will understand what you're talking about. If you try and communicate it in such a way which is data motivated and jargon led, then nobody's really going to understand that. So strip it back. Start with a community. And you know, the funniest thing is, he even said to me, before you start with anything else, start with your communications plan, start with your stakeholder map, and drive it from there, and get those people on board. And I tell you what, it was the most invaluable piece of advice that I've had in any of my roles. That's the first thing that I do.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice you had there.
No, I must say I was very lucky. But yeah, I think coupling the two is and making sure that you get the right balance between the communications approach to the right levels is important. I'm going to slightly switch the tack here. We've seen obviously a big drive in the industry around the use of technologies that would provide more advanced analytics, more predictive elements of the business, predicting which customers may buy or predicting which customers may churn. And we've had this label called big data attached to that as a fast-moving description of generating how much, the idea of how much data is being generated in companies now. Is data governance different in the age of big data?
So that's a very good question, and a very valid question at the moment. And I think if anything, all this big data analytics and AI and machine learning is actually just makes the need for data governance much more important. But I think you have to be a little bit clever and thoughtful about how you do it. We can't apply the more traditional approach to data governance to such high volumes of data. So by definition, you've got high volumes, it's changing quickly. So I can't see it going down very well if you say to somebody, right, so all this data in our data lake that we're going to use for this amazing analytics, we need to list every single field, we need to write definitions, we need to agree data owners, do data quality reports. I think that's probably going to get you thrown out of a meeting room and probably not too politely. But equally, I can see it's kind of not going to end that well if you decide that you're just going to scrape loads of data from the internet and magic will suddenly happen and you'll get the right answers. So we've got to find that happy ground. And also I've spoken to some companies who are getting very excited about big data analytics, but they haven't got their own internal data governance in place. So I think it's a two-piece thing. You have to make sure you understand your own data that you're going to be combining and feeding into this analytics. Do that properly. I don't think there's a way to fast-track that one.
No, there isn't.
And then you've got to work out what is possible, what is appropriate for the big data. So clearly defining everything, not good enough, but you might need to have to say that, the people that are consuming it are going to have, different roles than they have done traditionally, and say that, they're going to have to define and understand what that data is and have at least some idea of the limitations of it.
Correct.
Now, a lot of people will tell you that it doesn't matter when you have big numbers or big volumes of data, that the errors are less significant. And I think I'm not an actuary or a statistician or a quant, but I get that. I kind of can see their point, but I think it's going to depend on what you're using the data for. I did a webinar on ethics and AI and why it would be unethical to do artificial intelligence and machine learning without data governance. And some of the research that I did for that was really quite scary, and there really are life and death situations. So I think it's dependent on the type of analytics or AI or machine learning you're doing will depend on what degree of error or poor quality data you can accept.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I think that was kind of
okay. No.
On that.
I think it's a good point. There's something that you had mentioned about the fact that yes, you put data into a data lake, and typically the data that we're looking at there doesn't have those concrete definitions, as you mentioned. But even if it's unstructured, there is still definitions in an unstructured data set that need to be reviewed and understood. And I think that's the bit where I completely agree with you in terms of, there's still, people tend to say to me, oh, well, it's unstructured data, it's unstructured, but there is still some semblance in there. Even unstructured data has some kind of form to it, regardless of whether it's,
And if there's nothing meaningful in it, why are you using it?
Exactly, exactly. And that's what, and that's the basis of where people get caught in this whole game of putting stuff into a data lake, because, oh yeah, it's in there, we just chuck everything in there. Well, are you using it as a repository? Are you using it, a place to actually get insight from? And therefore you are going to have to understand what the fields are telling you, but not every single field, because you might not need them. So I wholly agree with you, and I think that's another trap that people get into when thinking about the two sides of even, structured through to unstructured and semi-structured data. So great and valid point. And it's a shame I didn't hear your webinar, but I'd love to get that link. If you can send that to me later, that would be great.
Yeah, we'll try and find that one. That one was quite scary doing the research for it, although it was interesting as well.
So look, my final question is something that you may have your finger on the pulse a lot more than I do, from focusing solely on data governance. But what's the future of data governance? Where do you see it heading?
It's one of those areas that I just think it's not going to go away. I think it needs to evolve as things change, and obviously AI and all that other things we were just discussing are kind of the focus of where we've got to change now.
Yes.
Another way that it's got to evolve is nearly every organisation I talk to these days is adopting agile project methodology.
Right.
And I think that you need to be evolving your approach to data governance if you had it in a non-agile environment, to make sure, because otherwise you're going to be seen as a blocker, and it's going to be definitely, no, we're not doing anything about data. Or do you scope the data definitions and data governance side of any new project? So I think generally the principles will remain the same, but I think that people have to remember that whilst it's not a project, it's here to stay. It's not right, we've done that, it's there and it will continue going. You've constantly got to be looking at what's changing, and there will be, I don't know what the next big thing will be after AI and machine learning. That will probably keep us out of mischief for a few years.
I think so, for a decade longer.
Probably till you and I retire. But there's other changes as well. I mean, you'll have organisation changes, your business might restructure, all these kind of things. So data governance is always evolving. The principles are the same, but you've got to be very conscious of your organisation and what impacts it, to make sure that you evolve your data governance framework so that it matches the needs of your organisation at any one time. Correct.
No, I totally agree, and I think it's just one of those things which I continuously see in organisations. The idea that, and I think I probably said it earlier on, it's a one-hit wonder. Once we're done, we're done. But actually it never ends, because you've got IoT, you will have, as you mentioned, AI and machine learning, you'll have deep learning, you'll have all of these things. Perhaps automation will get better, perhaps quality of data will get better, but the more that we generate of it, data, I think it will start to get, and the sources of data will start to be more externalized, and therefore we'll have to understand lineage, we'll have to understand the where it's come from and how it's going to be used, both from a BI and from a data science perspective, because if a data scientist doesn't know where it's come from, then there's regulatory issues and so on. So I think you're absolutely right about it being fundamentally the same, but changing with the landscape, changing with organizations, and changing with I guess regulations and new technologies as they arrive.
Definitely.
So yeah. Well, look, Nicola, I'd like to thank you for giving me your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on our webcast, and you've been a fantastic fantastic person to interview. I must say, brilliant, really, really, really good. And I'd love to have you back on the webcast at some other point. But just wanted to say thank you once again for your time.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for asking me, Samir. It's been great to have somebody who's, as enthusiastic about data as I. So it's been more of a lovely chat with somebody who gets data as much as I do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.